I want you to imagine you're living in London in the 1700s. You live in a cramped one-bedroom home with your spouse and your 4 children. The crowded and dirty conditions make the summers feel long and hot, but you look forward to the start of autumn. Like most highly urbanized areas in Europe at this time, smallpox is endemic in London, meaning that most adults have already had and survived the illness. You and your spouse both had it as children, and you both have the scars on your face to prove it. It took your sister's vision, and it took your brother's life. Then one day, you hear several children in the neighborhood have fallen ill with a fever and a cough, and that night, you'll go to bed wondering if your child is next. And almost inevitably, your youngest comes down with a fever and a cough. And for the next few weeks, you'll toss and turn in bed, praying it's just a fever and a cough. But surely enough, 10 days later, the characteristic red pock bumps and pustules emerge on your child's face and around their eyes and in their mouths. And it is at this point that it dawns on you with cold certainty what has infected your child. You immediately know at this point, your child has a 1 in 3 chance of surviving this illness. And if they do, they may be left permanently blind. And if not, you know that the scars on their faces will forever remind them of this autumn day in London. Thankfully, none of us today have to live with the constant psychological trauma that is or was smallpox, because over the last century, we have defeated what has been arguably history's greatest and most deadly enemy. Smallpox is the first and only human disease to ever be eradicated, thanks to mass vaccination programs that took place all over the world in the 1900s. And for many of us, smallpox still feels ancient. But in the last century alone, smallpox killed over 300 million people, more than all of the wars of the century combined. But eradicating smallpox was not an easy accomplishment, and nearly every step of the way, vaccination has been met with resistance and opposition and resistance and opposition. In fact, for as long as vaccines have been around, so too has the anti-vaccination movement. And you might be surprised to hear that the hot topics surrounding vaccines today, like power and autonomy, are actually older than the vaccine is itself. Before vaccination was developed in the West, inoculation was widely practiced for centuries in Asian and African countries. Inoculation is the process of taking a small amount of infected material from a sick patient, say with smallpox, and deliberately infecting a healthy person to cause a milder form of infection. That infected person usually survives and gains lifelong immunity. Inoculation paved the way for vaccination. In fact, the earliest evidence of inoculation is seen in a Chinese medical textbook published in the 1500s, 2 whole centuries before the first vaccination in Europe. For 2 entire centuries, the greatest opponents to inoculation were Western physicians and scientists who rejected it on the basis that inoculation was developed in the East, and thus outside of the realm of European enlightenment. And inoculation was chalked up to hocus pocus and ignored for 2 whole centuries. It wasn't until the early 1700s when aristocratic women of Europe began to inoculate their own children and advocate for the practice that it finally spread in Europe. One woman in particular, Lady Mary Montague, bravely advocated for inoculation after witnessing it in the Middle East, on the streets of Constantinople. Of course, she was met with great opposition from the exclusively male royal medical societies, but she was determined to help end the suffering that has taken countless of lives. Nevertheless, the anti-inoculation narrative persisted in the West and only shifted from opposing the practices of a few unenlightened Eastern populations to now opposing the practices of a few ignorant and uneducated women. Many of these arguments are not based in reasoning, but the reality is that the practice of inoculation was not perfect. Many people became seriously ill and a few died. It wasn't until the advent of the vaccine in the late 1700s by British doctor Edward Jenner that the Western world would finally embrace the practice of transferring immunity from one organism to another. It's said that Jenner, as a medical student, overheard the milkmaid say that because she had cowpox, she couldn't suffer from smallpox. Cowpox was similar to smallpox, but it occurred almost exclusively in cows and only rarely infected humans. But In contrast to smallpox, cowpox could not be transmitted from one human to another, and infected humans almost always survived. This excited young medical student Edward Jenner, who was determined to find a safer alternative to inoculation. On May 14, 1796, Jenner took fluid from a cowpox blister and scratched it into the skin of then 8-year-old volunteer James Phibbs, and a single blister rose up on the spot, and James recovered. And when exposed to smallpox later, he didn't develop the disease. This would go on to be the first successful account of vaccination in history, and it would change the world forever. For 10,000 years, smallpox has ruled over Asia and Europe and Africa as a monster that came and went and took with it a third of those who crossed its path. This tiny biological entity with a single piece of DNA has killed ancient Egyptian pharaohs and Asian emperors. It's taken down professional Roman armies, and it devastated the Aztec and Inca civilizations. It's almost hard to believe that anyone could oppose this vaccine knowing what we know now. But that's never been the case, and for as long as vaccines have been around, so too has the anti-vaccination movement. No later than 6 years following Jenner's first vaccine, the first anti-vaccination piece of satire appeared in the local London newspaper, depicting vaccination as this cow-like monster eating children by the basket and excreting them out the other end. And this opposition came from local rumors that transferring material from cows to people was unsanitary and unreligious, unchristian-like, unethical, unscientific. On the other side of the globe, in colonized parts of the world such as India and Africa, resistance to the vaccine was not a surprise. When an imperial power who just conquered your land suddenly comes in and offers you a free medical procedure, you're going to be skeptical. But within Europe, a massive anti-vaccination movement surrounding personal liberty was brewing and brewing and brewing. And one day, in the spring of 1885, it boiled over to the streets of Britain when 100,000 anti-vaccination protesters gathered in opposition to the smallpox vaccine mandates that had been expanding in Britain for over 30 years. Protesters held banners and chanted messages 150 years ago that still feel relevant today. Messages like, "Keep your children's blood pure," and "The mothers of England demand repeal." These protesters were composed of working-class citizens that were skeptical of the upper classes and the government telling them what to do. Recall that the 1800s was an age of very little trust in public authority. This was a time when British citizens could be subjected to public hangings for petty theft. At the same time, people were skeptical of medicine. It lacked reliable information, and up to a third of doctors were quacks, practicing outdated methods like bloodletting and leeching. So it's no surprise that medical and governmental mistrust was pervasive at this time. And still, so many opposed vaccination simply because it was new and the change felt uncomfortable. Many opted to continue practicing the dangerous and outdated exercise of inoculation over the safer option of vaccination simply because, to those who had grown up with inoculation, it felt familiar. And the smallpox vaccine, like the COVID vaccine today, felt foreign. But fortunately, over the course of the following 2 centuries, international physicians, public health leaders, policymakers, researchers, and epidemiologists would come together to defeat the illness that has plagued humanity for as long as history has been written. On May 8, 1980, the World Health Assembly gathered to officially declare the world and all of its people free of smallpox. 1980. After 10,000 long years of suffering. We missed it by this much. But what we have now that we didn't only a century ago is access to reliable information. Reliable information that has been the result of years and years of good scientific practice and data-driven medicine. This kind of information is invaluable. However, opposition to vaccination has persisted despite the overwhelming evidence we have today that it works and it's safe. I vow to always share this information with my patients, and to my fellow physicians out there, I encourage you to continue to educate your patients and revisit these difficult subjects. Be patient, be kind, and be persistent, because vaccines save lives. And to all of us out there in healthcare or outside of it, patient or provider, let's continue to educate ourselves by seeking out reliable information. Trust your healthcare providers, trust your scientists, and those who have dedicated their lives to keeping you and your family safe. Tonight, we can go to bed and rest comfortably, free from worry that every illness in our baby or our sister or our loved one is an immediate threat to their livelihood. For this, we can thank vaccination and a whole host of worldly people, from the Eastern Asian folk that introduced us to inoculation to Lady Mary Montague for bravely opposing the patriarchy and bringing inoculation to Europe, to 8-year-old James Phibbs, who bravely took that first vaccine, and to the countless others like James, who have risked or lost their lives in the conquest to save ours.